Stream started to become aware a little bit of the potential value. And then once the 1970s and 1980s, once you got into that era, then a lot more people thought in those terms. So obviously some people were collecting them from the start, but I don't think there was too much communication between collectors. Most people who did it were just doing it for themselves. One that made news was in the early 70s. This made national news. A teenage boy named Mitchell Meady paid, I believe, about $1,300 for a copy of Action Comics #1. So he was invited to go on talk shows. There was in national magazines and such, but he wasn't showered with praise. Most people said, this guy must be some kind of idiot. He got many letters and calls from other people who had copies saying, if you're paying $1,000, you know, I'm selling. But that was sort of one early time that it registered nationally.
When comics were created in the 1930s, they were a dime, but so were most magazines. Everything was a dime. 40s, 1950s, 1960s, prices escalate. Sports Illustrated, you know, Life magazine, big sellers, 25 cents, 30 cents, 40 cents, 50 cents. Comics made the deliberate choice to try to keep the prices low for children. That was a wise move, except the backfire was, by the time you get to the 1970s, they realized, wait, why am I giving shelf space to something that costs 10 or 12 cents and I'm only making 2 or 3 cents per copy? I could use that same shelf space for Playboy or Sports Illustrated, and I can make 50 cents or $1. And so almost overnight, in the late 1970s, convenience stores, grocery stores, they just stopped selling comics. Sales were plummeting in the late 1970s and early 1980s. There were specialty stores that sprang up, that still exist, and then to try to compensate for those years of being an underpriced item, prices rose very quickly in comics. Suddenly they were 25 cents, 50 cents, 75 cents, $1. Then these comic stores that had begun to spring up in the 1980s, they took the forefront in sales. They got the message out to the public that this is where you buy your comics. But they began trading in comics as collectibles, less so than enjoyable, readable periodicals.
À partir de 1986, The Dark Knight et les Watchmen font basculer les comics dans l'âge adulte. Enfin perçus comme objets culturels à part entière, ils attirent un public de collectionneurs nostalgiques et la valeur des plus anciens numéros s'envole. En 1992, la prestigieuse société Sotheby's met aux enchères son premier comic book Action Comics #1, qui sera vendu cette année-là pour $82 500. Après une violente crise dans les années 90, les super-héros redeviennent tendance et sur le web, l'explosion de sites de vente structure pour de bon le marché des collectionneurs.
I'm Barry Sandoval with Heritage Auctions, here to tell you about the Billy Wright collection, which is one of the great Golden Age finds in recent memory. We're the only company that still holds the traditional live auctions with an auctioneer and the people in the room, but we have added an online element to it. So you can attend those auctions and bid in person. You can also bid by telephone, or you can bid live on the internet watching a video of the auctioneer. And we still print full-color catalogs in the traditional style. We always want to create a very competitive environment with bidders, pitting bidders against each other to get the best possible prices, and we think that's the best way to do it.
Metropolis Collectibles is the largest dealership of vintage comic books in the world. In this room, there's over 150,000 vintage comic books. This is the largest accumulation of comic books from the 1930s to the 1980s in the world. Our company comprises over 100 years of experience in the collectibles market combined. I want to show you a great part of our office. Come on in. Now, many people would think, you know, okay, I'm going to this office, the showroom is filled with beautiful stuff. But even when they come into the bathroom, we want them to feel like a pop culture king when they sit on the throne. This bathroom is filled with over $500,000 worth of original art. We have pages from the first appearance of Thor by Jack Kirby, a page from Avengers #1, and here you have a classic scene, Submariner running through the streets of Manhattan. Moment of truth. What's gonna happen next? By Bill Everett, the creator, because he's my favorite artist in comics. He did not only great superhero art, he also did fantastic horror covers. If you see his horror covers from Venus, they're mind-blowing. Just fantastic. The buyers of these comic books are from every different walk of life. I always tell people there's a budget for every comic book and a comic book for every budget. So whether you can spend $50 or $50,000, $1 million, we can find the right comic book for your collection. So you have people who are garbage men, lawyers, doctors, producers, CEOs, Fortune 500 businessmen, stockbrokers, advertising executives, filmmakers, every different walk of life, you have people buying comic books. But you have to remember that almost every person in this country has read a comic book at one time or another in their life, has watched a cartoon with Superman, Batman, Spider-Man, has seen something, played a video game. And when they have that in their minds, eventually they're making money. I have some extra money. Maybe I should go buy a comic book. I say yes, you should.
Well, our role as an auctioneer is really to give our customers what they already want. Especially when you're getting into expensive things, it's hard to convince somebody to spend thousands of dollars for something that they haven't already decided that they want. So condition, of course, is a huge factor. The same, a mint copy of the same comic can be worth 1,000 times a beat-up copy of the same comics.
So I advise them on which comic books to buy, and then they decide, they buy. Some hold for a long time, and they do very well. Some hold for a little bit of time. Sometimes they do well, sometimes they don't, and they invest. It's become almost commoditized, and a big part of that is because of these plastic holder you see the comic book in. CGC has become a form of reassurance to, let's say, the average person on the street who does not know how to grade a comic book, who doesn't know how to check for restoration. They pay this company to do it, and they go, 8.5. Perfect. I know what it is. They can look up online how much does an 8.5 sell for, and they can go and buy it.
So the concept is that the comic is reviewed by 3 different graders who are neutral. It's a different company, so they have no affiliation with the people who submit the comics. And when the people looking at it don't know the identity of the owner. So 3 different graders review the comic and assign it a grade, and then they take the consensus of those 3 grades. They seal up the comic book in a plastic holder. So the idea is that as long as that seal has not been broken, the grade remains valid.
Dans les années 2000, les conventions de fans deviennent des rendez-vous incontournables de la pop culture. La plus ancienne et la plus importante est celle de San Diego, plus connue sous l'appellation de Comic Con. Au fil des ans, cette grand-messe a réuni de plus en plus de passionnés et de professionnels. Décliné dans plusieurs villes, le Comic Con est aujourd'hui un événement médiatique couru par le tout Hollywood, mais son âme reste avant tout représentée par les acheteurs et les vendeurs de comics.
Gotta make sure I look pretty. The wife's coming today.
We hold an auction in Beverly Hills once a year and in New York City once a year.
This is a consignment comic. This will be sold in our December auction. The catalog is coming soon, and people from all over the world will be bidding on this comic book.
So nothing here is actually for sale right now. It's all just a preview of items that will be auctioned in November. And so that's why the numbers we put on there are just our best guesses right now. But a comic with nice eye appeal I wouldn't be shocked if it sold for 10 or 20% more than this.
So what's really amazing about comic books is that you can have a comic book in one condition and it's worth one price, and you can have a comic book in a lower condition and it's worth something completely different. Case in point, let's take one of the most popular comic books around today, Incredible Hulk #1. What I'm going to show you is I'm going to show you a very low-grade copy of Incredible Hulk and show you the defects, and then I'm going to show you a high-grade copy. So here you have a 2.5 graded copy of Incredible Hulk. You can see the creases and the color loss over here. You can see the rusted staple. And you get down to the bottom staple, you can see there's actually some paper missing. If it's, you're not looking to spend $100,000 on a comic book, this is a very affordable copy, and it looks nice for its condition. Here you see a spectacular specimen, one of the highest graded copies in the world, a 9.0 Incredible Hulk #1. What you'll notice about this copy right off the bat is it's got incredibly rich colors. It almost looks like it was printed yesterday. This comic book looks almost perfect. It has a slight abrasion right here. A year ago, you could have bought this comic book for about $75,000 to $100,000. This comic book should sell for close to $200,000 in 1 year. You have to understand the Hulk market has exploded over the last few months. About 3 months ago, we made an announcement. We sold a 9.2 for $300,000. Will, I want to talk to you about that book we were talking about the other day. Sure. Let's talk about the Detective 27.
Okay. Yeah.
So, you know, you've been really tough about the price on this.
I have been.
And I understand why. I mean, it's the first appearance of Batman. It's in a 9.4 condition. You know, of course, moderately restored. But I need this book. Okay. And I need it for a client. Okay. And you got a little tough with me yesterday, but I want to come back and give you a second chance, give me a second chance, see if we can figure something out.
All right.
What's your bottom line on this?
550 is the number. I mean, it's...
I'd like to make you an offer, okay, and I can write out a check right now, okay, if you want to do the deal.
Hear it.
400 grand. I think 400 grand is a really nice offer. Like I said, I mean, you and I know that it's a great book, but it's not the easiest thing to do, is finding somebody with $500,000 to buy a comic book.
That's true.
And you came here to the show to try to sell it.
I did.
But be gentle.
It is. We're going to be a nice even number of $500,000.
5 is not going to let me do what I need to do with it. 5 is going to be way too tight for me to make something happen. That's why I came in at 4. I gave myself a little bit of room to negotiate. I can come up to 4 1/4. What do you think about that?
$475.
I think I know where this is heading.
Where's that?
Do it at 450.
Go for it.
All right, great. All right, I will be right back with the check.
Sounds good.
Thanks so much.
No problem.
What I've done is I've just made sure that our company is constantly buying all these first appearances. And what's been really amazing is for years we've had a lot of these comic books that we couldn't sell. They were slow. And now they mentioned that they may be in a movie, and explosion of prices. So we've seen the first appearance of Ant-Man, Doctor Strange, Miss Marvel, Nova, who the Nova Corps appeared prominently in the Guardians of the Galaxy movie, and now Nova #1 sells for $200. This is a comic book we couldn't give away just a year ago.
We were the first company to auction a comic for $1 million, and that was in 2010 when we sold Detective Comics #27, which is the first appearance of Batman. At the time, the auction record for a comic was about $300,000, and so we had advertised the comic as being potentially worth $500,000, and it actually then sold for $1 million. But something like an Action #1 or Superman #1, there's high demand, but also a very small supply that isn't going to get higher. I would think it would be hard for Silver Age to ever get to that level just because it's more common. The Silver Age comic that everybody wants is Amazing Fantasy number 15, which is the first appearance of Spider-Man. And there has been a copy that sold for $1 million of that. But what creates value is always the combination of scarcity and demand. So Amazing Fantasy number 15 isn't scarce by any means, but the demand is extremely high, and that keeps the value high.
We sold a 9.6 copy of Amazing Fantasy 15, the first appearance of Spider-Man, for $1.1 million. That is a world record. Nobody has even come close to this. And the reason we were able to do this is because 9.6 was one of one. There was only one known to exist. And the owner of the comic book was a very wealthy individual. And I said to him, literally, this is how I negotiated the deal. I said, would you sell it for $500,000? He goes, no. I said, I'm not offering this, but would you sell it for $1 million? And these are his exact words. He says, I'd sell it for $1 million because that way I could give the money to charity. I said, fantastic. I called up my buyer. I said, it's very aggressive price. It's very expensive, but you would own the best copy in the world. And I put a 10%, not even, a little less than 10%. I sold it to him for $1.1 million, and he was happy. The seller was happy. The world was happy, everybody was happy, and I got to be part of the biggest sale of my favorite superhero. It's a very exciting day for me.
Ces 10 dernières années, les records d'enchères ont été pulvérisés. En 2011, Nicolas Cage en personne vend son propre exemplaire d'Action Comics numéro 1 pour plus de $2 millions. Un seuil dépassé en août 2014 lorsqu'un acheteur anonyme débourse 3,2 millions sur eBay pour acquérir un autre original du même Action Comics dans un état de conservation quasi parfait.
I don't believe that the comic book market is a bubble. This is a market built up by thousands, tens of thousands, millions of people all over the world. Anytime somebody buys a comic book, they're part of the market, and they're part of what's feeding the market, pushing the market forward. So I'll give you for instance. This week, my company, Comic Connect, had their event auction. This was our spring event auction. 5 full days of people bidding on comic books and original comic art and toys and memorabilia. I cannot tell you how many new people were bidding in our auctions. I didn't recognize the names of half the bidders and winners of the most expensive items. People I'd never talked to before were spending over $100,000 with us. We had the Action #1 go for $175. We had Captain America #1, the first appearance of Captain America, sell for $307,000. A coverless copy of the first appearance of Batman in Detective Comics 27 sold for $30,000. A coverless copy. This market is strong. This market is here to stay. Just like the coin market, the stamp market, and the stock market, comic books are here to stay, and the market will continue to get stronger and stronger as time goes on.
I have no concern that prices will go down over the next decade for comics and comic art. Beyond that, it's hard to say if the kids buying comics today will have the same nostalgia for their things as my generation and older generations did when they were growing up. One thing that's certainly a concern is that these days, if a new comic sells 100,000 copies, it's one of the best-selling comics for that particular month. Back in the 1960s, they would cancel comics that sold less than 200,000 copies. So it's a smaller pool buying them when they come out, and the thing that people always pay the most for is the things that they're nostalgic for from their childhood. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see. It's hard to predict whether the generational shift, how that will change the market.
I feel like one of my jobs is I'm a protector, a guardian of nostalgia, of American pop culture, and I am the person who is able to bring back the fondest memories a person has of their life, which is usually their childhood. When they were first exposed to comic books, and they first had this this realization of this other world and this creativity and fantastic art and stories where anything was possible. You have to remember, this is before CGI, this is before computer-generated effects and incredible video games. Comic books were that world. We're able to bring those memories back to people in a way that makes them happy when they're holding them, when they're smelling them, when they're reading them.
Les comics portent en eux la transmission d'un héritage aux racines presque centenaires. Une culture née à New York, berceau historique de cette industrie, et personnage à part entière de l'univers Marvel.
Marvel is so wrapped up with New York that I can't even fathom a New York without Marvel there. You know, for so many of us, this was our first impressions of New York.
I lived in a small town in the Midwest where a water tower was one big structure on the edge of town. I was stunned when I first came to New York and saw the water towers, because suddenly there was this thing that I knew about, even though I had never seen one, because they were in the comic books. That had a tremendous impact on me. It made the heroes real.
Of course we know it's fiction and it's comic books and it's fantasy, but you still, you know, when you come to the city and see the buildings and that, you are actually expecting to see guys flying, you know, around those buildings and that. That's what makes New York so special.
When Ron Frenz and I worked on Spider-Man, I was very confident to let Ron handle the city, because Ron is a maniac when it comes to detail. He pulls out reference, he studies the city skyline, just make sure that everything was realistic. Because Ron often told me that he learned about New York City by looking at Marvel Comics.
I think that that's something that, you know, little kids who aren't from New York, it's a whole layer of what Marvel superheroes are. Instead of Gotham City or Metropolis, they're reading these really wonderful adventures about someplace that actually exists.
When the Marvel Comics first started that universe, one of the key things they did that was part of that whole level of reality, establishing believability, creating the human connection with the characters, was the idea that, unlike DC, they didn't set their superheroes in versions of New York City, like Gotham or Metropolis. They just said, no, it's New York City. Look out your window if you live in New York. Maybe Spider-Man will be swinging by. That was one of the main keys to making Marvel so attractive and so appealing. These were heroes right outside your window.
When the Human Torch and the Submariner first crossed over with one another, they were wrecking Manhattan. They were obliterating bridges and tunnels. They were fighting, and you could trace their fight all along the geography. And, you know, there's a couple things that are really important at that moment, because there's not just the New York underpinning, but there's also, you have these two characters that are created by different people, and they are brought under one roof. And that set the stage for New York City being, you know, the center of the Marvel Universe. And from then on, all of these characters were going to be integrated. You know, they're packed in this small city, and that's going to set the tone for the next 75 years. And I think that's what hooked me to Marvel Comics, was this window to a whole world. You read DC Comics, you read Superman and Batman, and at the time, you didn't need to pick up the next issue to find out what happened. And you didn't need to pay attention to Superman if you wanted to read Batman comics. But once you get into Marvel Comics, once you decide that you're going to give yourself over to that world, you have to go in all the way. Marvel really got lucky that Metropolis was, was taken, or Gotham City was taken, or Central City, because what could be better than having a real city as your setting? And somehow they cornered the market on that. Marvel almost trademarked New York City as a fictional adventure land.
Quand on regarde les tout premiers épisodes de Superman, on reconnaît des quartiers de New York, on reconnaît des noms de rues, enfin il y a des vagues indications, des vagues, il y a ce qu'on appelle la skyline, il y a les silhouettes d'immeubles, on reconnaît que c'est censé se passer à New York. Et puis, c'est une manière idéalisée de régler les problèmes de la société, c'est-à-dire qu'à chaque jour suffit sa peine, mais à chaque épisode, on parle des risques automobiles. Superman va voir les constructeurs automobiles et leur dit « mais attention, il faut arrêter de construire des automobiles dans lesquels les gens meurent, il faut faire mieux votre travail. » Il y a un épisode, il va voir les directeurs de casinos en leur expliquant qu'il faut arrêter de blanchir l'argent de la pègre. Ce problème de Superman qui va dans la ville et qui dénonce la corruption fait que très vite, DC va s'orienter vers une ville générique qu'on va appeler Métropolis. Et puis chez Batman, on va l'appeler Gotham. Parce que quand le super-héros arrive et puis dit la police est corrompue ou il y a un problème de criminalité en hausse, on ne veut pas trop vexer les institutions.
The fact that the stories occurred in New York City didn't really occur to me at the time as anything important. But as time went on, that became more and more important to me. Because in certain comics like Spider-Man and Daredevil, New York City was actually a character in those books. The characters were constantly interacting with the city. You know, Spider-Man would go over the Queensboro Bridge. Spider-Man would be taking the subway. Spider-Man would be going down to Grand Central Station. New York City was, kind of his best friend. In Daredevil, New York City was really an intimate part of what was going on. Daredevil was bouncing around Hell's Kitchen, which at the time I really didn't know what it was, but it sounded like a scary place.
The Fantastic Four have the Baxter Building, of course, and they integrate with the people, but they can they recede a lot. They go off to space. The X-Men are off in Westchester. Daredevil and Spider-Man would be the two.
Alors, si on fait le jeu du comparatif entre Marvel et DC, accidentellement peut-être, les personnages de DC sont plus souvent des notables. On a plutôt du milliardaire ou du top journaliste du meilleur journal de la ville, Clark Kent, Bruce Wayne, tout ça. Chez Marvel, on a plutôt le petit gars. On va dire le héros typique de Marvel, quand il est humain, on a plutôt une sorte de poulpeau qui serait devenu adulte. Et typiquement, c'est l'exemple de Steve Rogers, Captain America, dont on va muscler la légende au fil des décennies en racontant son enfance dans des milieux défavorisés, dans des rues, des choses comme ça. Typiquement, on retrouve ça aussi dans les 4 Fantastiques. Il y a Benjamin Grimm, donc La Chose, qui a eu son enfance dans une rue fantasmée qui s'appelle Yancey Street, qui est harcelé par les canailles de Yancey Street, qui d'ailleurs n'arrête pas de lui reprocher d'avoir oublié ses origines dans les bas-fonds et de lui faire des blagues et des choses comme ça. Et surtout, il y a l'apport de scénaristes tels que Joe Simon dans les années 40 et Stan Lee dans les années 60, en termes de super-héros en tout cas, qui donne un argot à ces personnages-là. C'est-à-dire que quand on lit les dialogues de La Chose, même s'il est au fin fond de la galaxie en train de lutter contre le terrible Galactus, La Chose s'exprime comme un New-Yorkais.
Marvel might not have had the same cultural impact without New York. Whether it was a conscious strategy or not, I don't know. And I don't know if we actually can know. I kind of doubt that on one day somebody said, we'll put them all in New York. They might have. But unless we could find someone who was there that day, it's very difficult to tell.
In the 70s, New York was a dirty, dangerous place. And I believe that certainly in the 60s and the 70s, the writers who were on those books really reflected New York because they all lived in New York City. Jerry Conway, at the time he was writing Spider-Man, he was about Peter Parker's age. And a lot of the things that were going on in Peter Parker's life were things that were going on in Jerry's life, not so much with the supervillains, but the other dramas.
Jack Kirby grew up on the Lower East Side, and that was a very famous, Bowery Boys kind of an atmosphere. And I think that the personality of the city and the personality of the people who were making the comic books were, they grew together. Again, I don't know that it was one of those things where there was a conscious urge to replicate New York attitude in the comic books so much as it just organically occurred. It was an intuitive connection.
You have to start with the fact that in the first half of the 20th century, New York was the gateway city for immigration to the U.S. And the tribes that were coming in at that time to New York were disproportionately the Jews of Eastern Europe, the Russian, what was called Pale of Settlement, and to a lesser extent, the Italians who had finally gotten the right to leave southern Italy and migrate. Those were the new poor people coming into New York. Some of those Jews became founders of the first comic book companies, rising up through printing and magazine distribution, because those were new and kind of scruffy businesses. The establishment groups, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, even the more established Catholics, didn't have a big presence in them, looked down on them, and were happy to leave them to the lesser people. When you look at the superhero part of the story, you're in the Depression, you're in a time of enormous pressure on these people's lives, and there's a real dream of what a better world can be. They've come across the globe in miserable conditions, so they wanted something better to happen, and they knew it wasn't going to happen easily. So it was very easy to imagine that some miraculous figure would have to come in and do something that would change the scheme of things.
When Joe Simon first came to New York in 1939, there was a fellow he was working with who said, you ought to try this new thing that they're just developing. It's called comic books. And that really only happened because Joe came to New York. Most of the comic book writers and artists would be in New York because they needed to be able to bring their material in to the office and it would be published.
I think the magic of New York City is that it's the aspirational capital of an aspirational country. America still believes it's a country of dreamers, where you can change your life, and whatever your gifts are, you can find a way to use them and bring them to life and make the world a better place. The people who are natural entrepreneurs in America have disproportionately moved to New York over the years, just as the people who were natural actors and beautiful people moved to Los Angeles to go into the movie business. New York was the place you came if you dreamed of starting a business, if you dreamed of changing the world. So it pulled from this enormous country in America the prime talent who were dreaming of making things better. And that was a very natural fit for the superhero dream.
La relation de Marvel par rapport à New York, elle passe aussi tout simplement par une relation aux États-Unis dans leur globalité. C'est-à-dire que Marvel a démarré très vite dans le patriotisme, là où DC attendait un peu que ça se passe. Et à un moment où les États-Unis n'ont pas encore tranché l'idée d'aller s'impliquer dans la Seconde Guerre mondiale, Marvel vient de commencer la publication de Captain America Comics. Sur la couverture, le héros patriotique casse la figure à Hitler. Ça ne plaît pas à tout le monde à l'époque. Et victime de menaces, l'éditeur donc est un petit peu sur la sellette et c'est le maire de la ville qui va leur assurer la protection de la police. Le deuxième point, c'est un moment qui va toucher bien entendu tous les New-Yorkais et bien au-delà, bien entendu, c'est le 11 septembre 2001. Et il faut comprendre que les bureaux de Marvel sont au centre de New York, qu'ils vont voir les attentats et les tours s'effondrer pratiquement de leurs fenêtres. Le personnel de Marvel fait partie des personnes qui sont évacuées dans la journée. Et bien entendu, avec des héros qui eux-mêmes vivent à New York, il est impossible de faire silence là-dessus. Et 2 à 3 mois plus tard, il y aura un épisode de Spider-Man où on voit les tours s'effondrer, on voit la réaction de Spider-Man et des autres protagonistes principaux de Marvel devant ce triste spectacle.
Everything that makes New York City special to me also makes Marvel Comics special to me. You know, it's because Marvel has this rich history, and it feeds from New York City's rich history. Everything you know about the 20th century in New York City, there's an analog with the Marvel Universe. And so you can look back and you can see the early 60s, the Mad Men era, as people like to say. You can see that in the Fantastic Four comics. Just going back and looking at the back issues of Marvel Comics can give you a history lesson of what city life was like over those years. There's also there's the fact that people come to New York and they come from all different backgrounds and somehow have to figure out how to live together, which, you know, how could that be, you know, any more prevalent in the Marvel universe? It's aliens are you know, trying to work with one another and find common ground. There's also, you know, the excitement of urban living, and it's all right there in the pages of those comics. It's something that I think, you know, is carried forth into the movies. That's something that's been really great to watch, is the way that the Marvel Comics movies celebrate New York City, and it's you know, it's a really great tradition.
So that connection with New York is a vital one, not just in terms of the fiction, but also the reality. People that are Marvel fans know very well the stories surrounding the creators who lived in New York and made those characters in New York City. There are entire books written just about the story of Marvel itself. All those larger-than-life people who were just real people, but they've become heroes in a sense to many fans worldwide, who lived in New York and created these characters. And now here we are at the New York Comic Con, which has become one of the largest events of its kind, certainly in this country, and brings together fans of all generations, people that love comics, movies, television, all kinds of media. They get to meet Marvel creators up close. They get to see the actors from all the latest films appearing on stage in front of them and presenting it. And that sense of intimacy, that connection with the reality, with that universe that they so love, the conventions are a huge part of that, because it brings creator and audience together in a way that even an individual film or a TV show can't do. It's part of a sense of community, and that's something that's fueled these comics and this universe since the very beginning. And New York is a huge part of that. It's a huge part of Marvel's identity.
San Diego, which is an amazing Comic-Con, but there wasn't a show like that at all in New York, which just didn't make sense, considering all of New York's rich publishing, comic book history, its media clout, its culture, you know? So we took it upon ourselves to create this idea and launched it in '06, and we had no idea what we were doing. And we expected about 10,000 people, and 25,000 people showed up. And the fire marshal shut the event down, and it was an unmitigated disaster, basically. And now, 9 years later, we have 150,000 people, and we still don't know what we're doing. So, you know, we've at least been consistent. So. It is 10-minute walk to DC's offices, a 15-minute walk from here to Marvel's offices. So, you know, you have a certain pride in your hometown show. Those two big publishers don't do a lot of events, really. But they did a show like New York Comic Con from the first year, when we really had no track record, but they supported it. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that it's in Gotham, it's in New York.
I know that DC Comics is moving to Burbank in the coming year. And I know that's very disruptive to the staff and certainly the creative community surrounding the staff. Some people wonder whether or not Marvel will eventually move to the West Coast. And all I can say is it's possible. The companies, I believe, were originally here because this is where publishing was located. And the comic book publishers were former pulp publishers, and that's where, you know, they started in New York, they stayed in New York. Now with the focus on the movies I can understand the need to move everybody to the West Coast.
It tells you a lot about where the comic book industry is going a little bit, right? And it's not just DC and it's not just Marvel. A lot of even medium-sized publishers are doing the same thing, which is they're developing IP, intellectual property, for multimedia platforms. And comic books may be the original format for that IP, but the idea is film, television, toy, home apparel, video games, right? And that world isn't as rooted in New York, per se, as the publishing world. So I think it's a physical sort of manifestation of the changes that have been going on in publishing, period, not just comics, but in comics as well, for quite some time, really.
In the early days of comic books, certainly in the early days of Marvel, the creative people, the writers, the artists, they all lived in New York City because that's how you had to deliver your work by hand. As time has gone on, people started delivering work, through the mail. And then came Federal Express, and now it's all email. You can live wherever you want and deliver your work. I work for publishers in Europe, and I work for I work for non-publishers on the West Coast. And it's all the same to me because all I have to do to send it is hit a button, and the script is gone.
You have to remember that Jack Kirby moved to Los Angeles and was one of the first people who actually worked away from New York while still working for New York publishing companies. Because of modern communications, the writers and artists no longer have to be anywhere near the offices of the publisher. And in a way, that's opened the world up much more broadly, and it has taken them out of an epicenter.
Even when most of the talent that work for Marvel, we don't live in the city, it's always, I don't know, makes you feel like part of the community, knowing that the office is still in New York. It still has a New York address and that. So I would like Marvel to keep here, to stay here for long or forever, If Marvel decided to leave the city at some point because of a business reason, well, my work doesn't change at all. But I think we all love to know that Marvel will stay here forever.
Nostalgia is a tricky thing, Like, you want everyone to stay in New York where they came from, but, things change, times change. There's now lights at Wrigley Field. I mean, the Washington Post has color photographs. Like, my CDs are worthless. Certainly my cassettes are. Like, the world changes. There's a part of you that says, man, it'd be cool if it stayed that way forever, and that sort of nostalgia could live on. But the world is changing, and how we do business is changing, and how people consume content is changing, That history, that New York being a character in comic books won't change because of where the publisher's offices are based. When DC moves to Burbank, I don't think that, that Gotham's going to change to be a, flat city by the sea with lots of highways, like that history remains.
I'm a New York boy. I came into comics hanging around the offices of the many different comic book companies that were in New York in the early 1970s. DC, Marvel, Warren, Gold Key, Archie. I was up at them all after school on different afternoons. So each time one of them closes or moves their doors somewhere else, I feel sad because that's a piece of my childhood moving away. You can run a great business from anywhere. I'm sure that DC and Los Angeles will still be a magical company and will do wonderful things. And be magic for the young people who are working there who are just starting out today. My magic time was a few decades ago, and I get to keep that.
Pour des millions de lecteurs, le cœur des comics battra toujours à New York. Mais c'est en Californie que s'écrivent désormais les pages les plus déterminantes de l'avenir des super-héros. Pour toucher un plus large public, Marvel s'est aussi implanté à Hollywood. Depuis le premier Iron Man en 2008, Marvel Studios a réalisé un sans faute au box-office mondial en 10 films, tous produits par ses soins. Mais son aventure au cinéma aura nécessité 8 années de tâtonnement et surtout, en amont, une réinvention par l'éditeur de ses propres comics.
Dès 1999, dès 2000 à peu près, arrive cette réalisation qu'il va y avoir des films, des grands films, tels que Spider-Man, tels que les X-Men, et qu'on a des histoires peut-être dans les comics qui sont chargées de 30 ou 40 ans de continuité, qui sont peut-être un peu trop complexes, et on se dit qu'on va inventer un nouveau départ parallèle aux héros en place, et on va lancer la gamme Ultimates, qui repose principalement sur 3 titres au début, qui sont aux surprises, Ultimate Spider-Man et Ultimate X-Men, qui sont donc raccords avec un certain esprit cinématographique, on va dire. Et on va arriver à cette 3e série, là aussi, où les gens vont se dire, tiens, pourquoi faire une série qui s'appelle Les Ultimates tout court, qui reprend les membres des Avengers, donc des Vengeurs, mais dans un nouveau contexte, et là aussi beaucoup plus cinématographique. Et dans ce nouveau contexte, qui est donc mené par le scénariste Mark Millar, qui est écossais, et puis son compère Brian Hitch, le dessinateur, qui a une grosse importance dans la narration, on va réinventer des codes. Réinventer des codes, ça veut dire se poser la question de, finalement, pourquoi dans les grands personnages importants, il n'y a pas de décisionnaire noir. On va décider que Nick Fury, finalement, il pourrait être noir, il pourrait avoir, pourquoi pas, le visage de Samuel Jackson. Et on va faire des choix qui vont être décisifs pour l'avenir, parce qu'on codifie finalement l'esthétique, le comportement de héros un peu plus potages peut-être, mais aussi un peu plus politique. Et on crée le blueprint de ce qui va être les Marvel Studios 4 ou 5 ans plus tard. C'est-à-dire que c'est là-dedans qu'il y a l'ADN de ce Captain America, de cet Iron Man-là, de ce Thor-là, et bien entendu des films Avengers. Donc c'est du prêt à adapter, c'est pensé pour parler au public cinéma. Et le jour où Marvel va se dire on va au cinéma, ces séries-là vont servir de plan de guerre.
DC had an advantage in filmmaking in that they were tied intimately with Warner Brothers. And so you had Superman the movie and Batman, and you had the Wonder Woman television show. And all of them were based upon 3 of the most iconic characters in existence. Marvel had essentially 2 properties that were that iconic, Spider-Man and the X-Men. In that day, Marvel had no specific studio tie. And so those 2 properties were developed with Sony and 20th Century Fox. There were a lot of secondary characters who were not going to be developed because they didn't have that icon status of Spider-Man and the X-Men or Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. And I think that the Marvel film division grew because there was a frustration that there were all of these really rich characters who weren't being used as film.
Pendant des années, Marvel a tenté de percer au cinéma. Ça s'est pas fait. DC, qui était une filiale de Warner, avait